My name is Michael Taylor, and what I'm about to tell you isn't easy for me to share. I've spent years trying to forget, trying to convince myself it didn't happen the way I remember. But some things refuse to be forgotten. Some memories claw their way back, dragging you to the brink of madness. It began in the quiet little town of Ossett, West Yorkshire in the early 1970s. My wife, Christine, and I led a simple life. I worked odd jobs and she cared for our children. Life wasn't perfect. We argued like any couple, but we were a family. At least we were until I met her. Marie Robinson. She was a striking young woman, full of charisma and confidence. She led prayer meetings at our local church, and her passion was contagious. At first, I joined the group out of curiosity, but soon I found myself drawn to her energy, her unwavering faith. It felt like she could see inside me, even into the dark corners of my soul that I'd kept hidden. Christine didn't like it. She said I was changing, that I was spending too much time at those meetings. She was right, but I didn't care. Something about Marie made me feel alive, like I'd finally found a purpose. Soon after, the darkness started creeping in. It began with whispers. Late at night, when the house was silent, I'd hear them. Soft, sibilant voices murmuring just out of earshot. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They called my name over and over until I couldn't sleep. Christine noticed, of course. She told me I looked tired, that I needed to take a break. But how could I explain it to her? How could I tell her that every time I closed my eyes, I saw things? Horrible things. Visions of writhing, twisted forms. Faces contorted in agony. A woman's voice, cold and mocking, whispering blasphemies in my ear. And then there was the rage. It came out of nowhere like a storm brewing deep inside me. One moment I'd be calm, and the next I'd be screaming, smashing plates, throwing furniture. I couldn't control it. Christine and the kids started walking on eggshells around me, their eyes filled with fear. I hated myself for it. But the worst part was that the rage didn't feel like mine. It was as if something else was inside me, pulling the strings. One night, after a particularly vicious argument with Christine, I broke down. I confessed everything, the whispers, the visions, the rage. She listened quietly, her face pale, and then she said the words that would change everything. "You need help, Michael. You need God." She reached out to the church, and soon enough they agreed. They said I was under attack, that I needed deliverance. The exorcism was scheduled for the following week. I remember the night of the exorcism like it was yesterday. The church was cold and dimly lit, the flickering candles casting eerie shadows on the walls. There were 6 priests in total, including Father Peter, the man leading the ritual. They surrounded me, their voices rising in prayer as they clutched their crucifixes and holy water. At first, nothing happened. I sat there, my head bowed, feeling foolish. But then, as Father Peter pressed the crucifix to my forehead, something inside me snapped. The rage surged through me like a tidal wave. My body convulsed violently, and a guttural growl erupted from my throat, a sound no human should be able to make. "You think you can save him?" A voice spat from my lips. "He belongs to us now." The priests didn't stop. They continued their prayers, their voices growing louder as I thrashed and screamed. I felt hands pinning me down, but they weren't enough. My strength wasn't my own anymore. And then, the visions returned, more vivid than ever. I saw Christine and the children, their faces twisted in terror, their screams echoing in my head. I begged them to stop, to leave my family alone. But the voice only laughed. "You'll destroy them yourself," it hissed. "Just you wait." At some point during the exorcism, I blacked out. When I came to, the room was silent. The priests were slumped against the walls, exhausted, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. "It's done," Father Peter said. "The demon has been cast out." But I didn't feel free. The next few days were a blur. I tried to return to normal, to be the husband and father my family needed. But the darkness lingered. I could feel it just beneath the surface, waiting for an opportunity to strike. That opportunity came one fateful night. Christine and I were arguing again. I can't even remember what it was about. Something trivial, something stupid. The kids were asleep upstairs and the house was quiet except for our raised voices. Then, without warning, it happened. The rage consumed me, hotter and fiercer than ever before. I wasn't in control anymore. My hands moved on their own, striking Christine, her screams piercing the air. I wanted to stop. I was screaming inside my own mind, but my body didn't listen. It was as if I was trapped, a passenger in my own skin. And then, everything went black. After the blackout, I was standing in the middle of the living room, my hands covered in blood. Christine was on the floor, lifeless, her face unrecognizable. The children had woken and came down to see what all the noise was about. I can still hear their cries filling the house, and I will never forget the look of fear on their face when they saw what I had done. But it wasn't just their cries that haunted me. It was the laughter, a low, guttural laughter that echoed relentlessly in my own head. The police arrived shortly after, alerted by the neighbors. I was arrested, of course. The newspapers were quick to report on this dark, twisted tale that shocked the town of Osset. The exorcism never saved me. The demon didn't leave, it just hid, biding its time. And sometimes, late at night, when the cell is quiet and the darkness presses in, I can still feel it, waiting, watching, and laughing. They say faith is the shield against evil, but I learned the hard way that sometimes the shield cracks. My name is Father Lucas, and for decades, I've worn the cassock, carried the cross, and whispered prayers into the void. But all the faith in the world couldn't prepare me for Clara Germana Cele. It was 1906, in a convent perched on a hill in Natal, South Africa. The place had always felt like a sanctuary. Quiet halls, soft candlelight, the whispers of nuns praying in the early hours. But sanctuaries don't always keep the darkness out. The headmistress, Sister Mary, met me at the gate. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, like someone who'd been staring into the abyss too long. She gripped my hand hard. "Father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need you." Clara. Something has her. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. They led me to her room. The corridor was dark, the air damp, each footstep echoing like the strike of a bell. When we reached her door, Sister Mary hesitated, gripping her rosary so tightly I thought it might snap. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. It wasn't the disarray, though the room was a wreck with furniture overturned and the wallpaper clawed to shreds. It was the air, thick and wrong, like walking into a room after something had died. The smell hit me next, sulfur and rot. And then, there she was. Clara sat on the floor, her back against the wall, her knees drawn to her chest. Her head lolled unnaturally, like a doll's neck too loose on its string. Her eyes locked on mine, two black voids that seemed to pull the light out of the room. She grinned, slow and deliberate, and her voice, God help me, wasn't hers. "You've come to save her?" It was a man's voice, low and guttural, layered over something that hissed. "You're too late, priest." The nuns filled me in. Clara had always been a spirited girl, a bit rebellious but kind. Then she'd confessed to them about making a pact with the devil. She claimed it was a joke, a childish dare. But after that, the changes came. At first, she became volatile, prone to fits of rage. Then came the unexplainable. Objects flying across the room, disembodied voices calling the sisters' names at night, the sound of growling when no animals were near. And Clara herself? She spoke languages she couldn't possibly know, languages no one could identify. One night they found her levitating above her bed, her body bent at an impossible angle. That's when they sent for me. The first time I faced her, I thought I was ready. I approached her bed, clutching the crucifix, my voice steady as I began the rites. She writhed against the straps that held her down, snarling like a feral animal. When I sprinkled holy water on her, she let out a scream so piercing, so raw, it felt like the air itself was bleeding. Her skin bubbled and hissed where the water touched her. She turned her head toward me, her grin widening, her teeth unnaturally sharp. "Is that all you've got?" she spat, her voice slithering through the air like smoke. And then she laughed, a sound that seemed to crawl inside my ears and nest there, wriggling. The days blurred together. The battle was relentless. Clara's strength was inhuman. It took 3 of us to hold her down when she thrashed. She twisted her body in ways that no bones should bend, her joints popping and cracking like dry branches. She taunted us constantly, mimicking our voices, turning our prayers into blasphemies. "Your God has abandoned you," she'd say, her voice dripping with venom. "You're nothing but insects pretending to be lions." The nuns were terrified, some too shaken to even step into the room. But I couldn't stop. Then came the night I'll never forget. We had just finished an exhausting day of prayer and ritual, and I returned to my chambers to rest. But before I could sleep, I heard it. The sound of footsteps in the hallway, slow and deliberate. I opened my door to find Clara, unrestrained, standing there. Her head tilted at an impossible angle, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "Why don't we pray together, Father?" she whispered, her voice sickly sweet. Before I could react, she dropped to the floor, her body contorting violently. Then she started to crawl, backwards. Her limbs jerked and twisted as she climbed the walls, her head spinning around to face me even as her body defied gravity. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The sight was beyond reason, beyond anything I'd ever imagined. Her mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and from it came a torrent of voices. Men, women, children, all screaming, crying, laughing. "You can't save her," they chorused. "She's ours." We dragged her back to the room, the nuns and I praying desperately as she fought us. Her nails clawed at my arms, drawing blood, her strength far beyond what her small frame should have allowed. That night we began the final exorcism. The room felt alive with malice, the air electric with tension. Clara screamed and thrashed, her body rising and falling as if pulled by unseen strings. As we prayed, she began to levitate, her body contorted, her face a mask of rage. She spat obscenities in languages I didn't recognize, her voice echoing with unnatural depth. And then, it happened. Her body arched upward, and her mouth opened, wider than I thought possible. A black, viscous mist began to pour out of her, filling the room with its foul stench. The mist writhed and twisted, forming shapes that flickered and dissolved. Faces, clawed hands, monstrous figures. The nuns screamed, some collapsing to the floor in terror. I gripped the crucifix tighter, my voice breaking as I shouted, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave." The mist recoiled, hissing like a cornered snake. It writhed one last time before it exploded outward, dissipating into the air. Clara collapsed onto the bed, her body limp, her breathing shallow. When she opened her eyes, they were clear again, no longer the black voids that had haunted me. "It's gone," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. We fell to our knees, overcome with relief. But as I left the convent that night, the memory of her voice, her laughter, lingered in my mind. Even now, decades later, I can still hear it sometimes, faint and mocking, carried on the wind. And I wonder if the darkness is truly gone, or if it's just waiting for its next invitation. They say the devil only comes when you call him, but I never believed it. I was just a kid, a stupid, bored kid. But one evening, while the February wind howled outside, I made the mistake that would haunt me forever. The Ouija board had been my Aunt Harriet's. She was eccentric, always talking about the spirit world and thin places where the veil between life and death didn't exist. I found it in her room when she passed away. At first, I thought it was just a game, a piece of harmless fun to distract from the monotony of small-town life. The house was quiet that night. My mom hummed in the kitchen, and my dad was in the den, the scratchy sound of his radio barely audible through the walls. I sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, my fingers trembling as I set them on the planchette. I wasn't afraid. Not then. Not yet. I closed my eyes. "Aunt Harriet," I whispered, "are you here?" At first, there was nothing. I let out a nervous laugh, slightly relieved that there was no response. Then the planchette jerked under my fingers. My breath hitched. Slowly, the pointer slid across the board, stopping at YES. Is it really you?" I asked, my voice barely audible. My hands trembled, but I couldn't lift them from the board. The pointer moved faster now, darting across the letters like it had a mind of its own. Z-O-Z-O. Zozo? I whispered. I knew as soon as the word left my mouth I had made a mistake that couldn't be undone. Saying the name felt like an invitation. I felt a rush of coldness all around me and I ran out the room. That night, something in the house shifted. The air was suffocating as if the walls themselves were closing in. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the old house sounding like footsteps. Then, just as my eyelids began to droop, the bed shook. Not a gentle tremor, but a violent jolt that sent my heart racing. I shot upright, gripping the sheets as if they could protect me. "Mom? Dad?" I called, my voice small and frightened. No answer. A soft scratching sound filled the room, faint at first, but growing louder. I turned toward the wall and saw them. Deep, jagged marks etching themselves into the plaster. 3 parallel lines, as if made by claws. My parents blamed the cat, but I'd seen that poor thing cowering in the corner, hissing at something invisible. The nights that followed were worse. The sound started in the attic, a rhythmic pounding, steady and deliberate, as if something was trying to dig its way out. My dad went up there once, armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat. He came back pale, shaking his head. "Nothing up there," he muttered, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. And then, one night, the pounding stopped and I was finally able to drift off to sleep. I couldn't have been asleep more than 5 minutes when I woke up suddenly, pinned to my bed. The weight on my chest was unbearable, like a boulder crushing the air from my lungs. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it. A figure stood at the foot of my bed, cloaked in shadows. It didn't have a face, just a void where a face should be. A swirling darkness that seemed to pull the light out of the room. It leaned closer, and I felt its breath, cold and fetid, against my skin. "You called me," it hissed, the words not spoken aloud but planted directly into my mind. I was unable to move and unable to scream. I was just lying there, frozen in fear as the figure edged closer. That's when my parents finally saw it for themselves. They couldn't deny it any longer. My mom burst into my room and there I was, floating. That's what they told me later anyway. My body was suspended inches above the bed, my back arched unnaturally. I had no memory of it. But the look on their faces told me everything I needed to know. They called the priest that same day. Father Hughes arrived that evening. A tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to see right through you. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, he walked through the house, sprinkling holy water and muttering prayers in Latin. When he reached my room, he stopped abruptly. The air grew colder and his breath fogged as he exhaled. "It's strong," he said, his voice steady but grim. "Very strong." The exorcism began that night. They tied me to the bed, not to hurt me, but for their own protection. Father Hughes stood at the foot of the bed, clutching a crucifix and his prayer book. My parents hovered in the doorway, their faces lined with fear. At first, nothing happened. The priest recited his prayers, his voice firm and commanding. But then I felt it. Something was happening. The thing inside me was waking up, pushing against my skin like it wanted to tear its way out. I screamed, an inhuman sound that didn't feel like it came from my own throat. My body convulsed, fighting against the restraints. I thrashed around so violently with a strength that wasn't my own. I ripped right out of the restraints. My spine arched, lifting me off the bed. and my head twisted at an angle that shouldn't have been possible. I felt my limbs move, but I wasn't the one moving them. I crawled up the wall, my body contorting like a spider, and hung there upside down, staring at my parents. "Robbie, stop!" my mother screamed, but her voice was distant, as if coming from another world. Father Hughes stepped forward, his crucifix held high. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this child." The room erupted into chaos. Furniture shook, windows shattered, and a deep demonic laugh filled the air. A sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl. The battle lasted hours, maybe longer. By the end of it, the room was destroyed. Walls scorched, furniture splintered, and the air thick with the smell of sulfur. I don't remember much of what happened, just flashes. Father Hughes shouting, my parents crying, and the shadow, darker and more solid than before, looming over us all. But I do remember the moment it left. One final blood-curdling scream tore my vocal cords, and then I collapsed, limp and exhausted. The shadow was gone, but its presence lingered, a stain that couldn't be washed away. Even now, years later, I can still feel it sometimes, just out of sight. Watching, waiting. Because I know it's not really gone. It never is. It's always waiting to be invited back into this world. All it takes is to hear you say its name. Zozo.